Tonight, I'm sharing 4 chilling encounters from Maine's most isolated cabins. The first story involves a hunter snowed in, a cabin with no power, and a lantern that drifted room to room like it had a mind of its own. And by the end, you'll understand why he never camps alone in Baxter again. If eerie, slow-burn stories like this keep you up at night, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new horror every day to feed your need for the unexplained. This account comes from a man who signed his message as CD, a 40-something Mainer with the kind of patience you only earn from sitting in the tree line for hours at a time. He said he wasn't easily rattled, grew up on snowmobile trails, learned to dress a deer before he learned to drive, knew the sound of spruce branches groaning under ice, and the way the woods go quiet before a squall. He told me this happened in late January, after the holiday visitors had gone home and Baxter State Park lay under a crust of blue-white snow. The cabins you can rent up there are simple: a stove, a bunk, a table that lists back and forth unless you set a folded map under one leg. No power, no running water, just you, your stove, your breath. He went to be alone with the trees and his thoughts, he said, maybe to shake something loose that had settled heavy in him over the past year, a divorce, a job that started as temporary and never moved on. He packed light: wool layers, a lantern, a hatchet, a thermos, a paperback he never quite finished, and one of those little battery radios that catches weather reports and gospel stations from God knows where. He reached the cabin by midday, snow squeaking under his boots, and the cold so sharp it felt like chewing mint. The lake nearby wore a skin of ice that whistled when the wind walked across it. The sky was high, hard, cloudless. He unlocked the door, one of those big iron keys that make you feel like you're borrowing something important, and stepped inside. It smelled like cedar and ash and old wool. He liked it immediately. He swept out some drifted snow, stacked wood by the stove, and hung his lantern on a nail by the door. Not the battery kind. This was a proper kerosene lantern, glass globe rubbed clean with the tail of his shirt, and a flame that answered in a soft blue wink before settling to steady yellow. He liked the sound it made, a hush, like someone breathing politely. He made coffee on the stove. The day dimmed the way winter days do, too early and all at once. The forest turned the deep gray of a held breath. He told me this part plainly. He sat. He read a few pages. He dozed with his boots on. The lantern warmed the room with light like honey. The radio found a hymn sung thin and determined by a choir that might have been 3 people in a kitchen somewhere. Everything was quiet, ordinary, good. The first odd thing was small. He woke with his head tucked into the crook of his arm, cheek hot from the stove and shoulder cold. His lantern wasn't on its nail. It sat on the table, nearer to him than it had any reason to be, flame still upright and steady. He had no memory of moving it. He told himself he must have, half asleep. He hung it back up. He went outside to use the outhouse, stars stitched tight across the sky, cold curling up under his coat like a cat. And when he came back in, the lantern stood on the floor by the bunk. Not knocked over, not spilled, placed. The glass globe free of soot, the flame burning so true it might have been painted there. He laughed, the kind of sound that says, "I refuse," politely, to be unnerved. He picked up the lantern, hung it again, and this time set the chimney's little lever so the globe squeaked in the bracket. He told the room, "Stay put," because that's how you talk to dogs and boats and gear that likes to wander on its own. He ate, he tuned the radio, and he wrote a few notes in the margins of his paperback that he wouldn't remember later. Snow started while he was chewing the last of his jerky, soft at first, then purposeful, the kind of snow that erases edges. He pulled on his coat, opened the door a crack to listen, and heard it, a low, long groan from the lake ice, far and clean and tired. He closed the door against the cold and turned to the room. The lantern sat on the windowsill. He hadn't heard it move, hadn't felt the slight wobble a cabin floor gives when something heavy shifts. It glowed a soft yolk color, haloing the frost that had crept up from the pane's corners like lace. Its reflection made two moons in the glass. CD said this is when the world inside him tilted a degree. The small part of his brain that handles latch and hinge logic went quiet. Another part, older and more useful in the dark, took over. He didn't speak, he didn't joke with the room. He walked carefully, like you do approaching a dog you don't know. And he lifted the lantern from the sill. The glass was warm. The handle was cold. He carried it back to its nail, hung it, and felt foolishly relieved. He banked the stove, crawled into the bunk, and watched the lantern through the half-lidded gaze of someone who intends to pretend sleep. He told me the flame's shadow made a long black finger up the wall, and when the stove snored and the wind pressed its whole mouth against the cabin's seams, he dozed again. Sometime after midnight, he woke with his face lit too bright. The lantern was next to him on the bunk, set gently on the rough wool blanket near his hip. It wasn't singeing anything. It wasn't dangerous. It sat there like a bedside lamp in a house with central heating and a dishwasher and bills that came on time. He moved very slowly. He reached out and pinched the knob, intending to snuff the flame, and the glass chimed under his fingers. One sweet, quick note like a spoon on a jar. The flame did not dim. It leaned, he said. Leaned toward him, like a candle you carry through a hall and turn toward a face you love. That's when he heard the other sound. A careful step on the porch boards outside, then another. Not heavy, not urgent. A person coming home late and hoping not to wake the house. He froze. He told me his hand went cold from the inside out, the way you get when you see a shape at the edge of a flashlight's reach that might be a bear and might be a stump. He slid out of the bunk, placed his feet on the floorboard he knew from evening would not squeak, and with the lantern in hand, because of course he trusted it now, what choice did he have? He stepped to the door. He held his breath and listened. He heard breathing, not the wind's long sigh, human, slow, patient, as if someone held their ear to the door in mirror of his posture. He whispered, "You lost?" Because that's the decent thing you ask in the wilderness. The breathing paused. The snow's hush pressed closer. Then from the other side of the door, a voice spoke into the wood and through it, muffled, almost polite. It sounded like an old man who had been outside too long and buttered his words with cold. It said light. That's all. One syllable. Request or recognition, he couldn't tell. CD said he turned the latch with the care of a man disarming his own trap. He opened the door an inch, then two. Wind shouldered in, bringing a flap of fine snow. He held the lantern up, and the light slid across the porch planks and out into a world so white and close it felt like standing inside a quiet, held breath. No one stood there, but there were footprints, bare, wide as a man's palm and longer, toes delicate, the kind of prints a child makes on the first hot day of the year when the grass still remembers frost. They came up the steps, across the porch, and ended at his door. No prints led away. He stepped out, because he is that kind of person. He said the cold found all the places he'd left unbuttoned. He held the lantern high, and the flame burned steady as if the world were warm. The porch boards were empty. The lake groaned again, nearer.
The trees wore their white in stillness. He said the prints were not melting. They were not filling with blowing snow. They looked pressed into the porch only a second ago and preserved by something with more will than weather. He whispered, "Hello?" And the snow fell quieter as if it too were listening. Behind him, inside the cabin, something moved. He turned so fast the flame should have blown out. It didn't. He stepped back in and closed the door with a careful shoulder. The room looked exactly as he'd left it. Bunk, stove, table with his paperback open spine down. The lantern threw its honey light on every familiar edge. He almost laughed at himself, at the way the mind tries to put its own foot in any print it finds.
And then he saw the second lantern. He does not own a second lantern. This one sat on the table across from his book. It was not his. The glass was taller and slenderer, the metal a darker, older kind. It was lit. Its flame was not yellow like his, more white, like the part of a candle that burns closest to the wick. It made the pencils in the mug throw twice the shadow. He did what men without a script do. He spoke to it as if it were a horse someone left tied to his fence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, because that was true, and also because naming a thing sometimes helps it soften. The second lantern answered him the way a neighbor might when you open your door too slow. It lifted. Not by a hand, not with a jerk. It rose until its base cleared the table by the height of 2 fingers, and then it glided toward him through the air, as if the space between them were a hallway. He stepped back and caught his own lantern by instinct, like taking a friend's elbow at an icy curb. The 2 lamps paused with a respectful space between them. It is silly to say they looked at each other, but that is how he wrote it to me, and when you have no other words, you use the ones that are shaped like what you feel. The door, which he had latched, sighed. Not opened, sighed, like a chest deciding to breathe. The wind in the seams shifted to a different key. The white-flamed lantern turned toward the door, waited. His lantern warmed his wrist where the handle touched, a small, steady pressure that felt like, stay. He did not open the door. He did not snuff either lamp. He stood, very still, and listened to the quiet try to decide whose it was. On the wall by the bunk, a photograph he hadn't noticed earlier unstuck from its tack and slid down, landing face up on the blanket. He picked it up. It was old, paper gone soft at the corners by thumb and time. The image showed his exact cabin. Same door, same nail by the jamb, same window's fog. On the porch, 3 men stood with the squint of winter. 2 held lanterns. One was the kind he owned, fat-bellied and stubborn. The other was slender, white-centered. The third man held nothing. He stood slightly sideways to the camera like a person who wants to look like he belongs, but hasn't decided if he does. CD said he recognized none of their faces, but he knew the set of their shoulders, the shape a man takes after the woods have kept his secrets, and asked nothing in return. He looked from the photo to the table where the second lantern had come to rest again, and to his own, warm in his hand. He said, "You want this," to the empty air, and felt foolish a second time. The white-centered flame drew long, as if nodding. He set his lantern on the floor and reached slowly for the other. It was cold to the touch, deep cold like something kept outside on purpose. He lifted, expecting weight. It was light as a thing that belongs to memory. He carried it to the door. He did not open the latch. He held it near the seam and felt the smallest pull, like a tide reaching through a crack. The flame leaned toward the dark. He raised the latch and opened the door just wide enough to pass the lantern through. On the porch, the white flame flared brighter, then settled. The bare footprints on the board shimmered the way water does when wind walks across it, and then blurred like a photo remembered and half forgotten. The lantern moved. Not fast, not dramatic. It glided to the top of the steps and held a moment there as if to make sure he saw.
then drifted out into the snow as if snow were a floor and not a fall. It went toward the lake. It did not sink. It crossed the white with the careful disdain of a person used to winter.
CD stood in the door with his own lantern at his ankles like a well-behaved dog. He watched the other light pause at the lake's edge, hover there while the ice gave a long, tired sound, then continue, out over the black of it, across, and into the trees opposite. It dimmed, not with distance, but with completion. It went out the way a breath does when you realize you have been holding it since you were a child. He closed the door. He hung his lantern back on its nail. He picked up the photograph from the bunk. The third man, the one with empty hands, now held a lantern. Slender, white-centered. He did not sleep so much as remember how. When morning came, gray and honest and slow, he went outside and swept the porch with the broom he found leaning in the corner. He doesn't know why he did that. He says the boards looked satisfied after he did. He took the photograph with him when he signed out at the ranger station. He asked the woman at the desk if she recognized the men. She shook her head, but when he showed her the cabin, her face changed a little in that quiet way people don't notice about themselves. "That place will keep you company," she said, not unkind. "People leave things behind. Sometimes they come back for them. Sometimes they don't." He left the photo on the desk. He didn't want to take it home. He said as he drove south, the sky hardened into that bright, brittle blue that means the cold intends to stay a while. His lantern rode on the passenger floor, wick trimmed short, globe clean, smelling of kerosene and something like old cedar. That night, back in his apartment, he set the lantern on the kitchen table and didn't light it. He watched the glass turn his apartment's lamplight into small, curved copies of itself. He slept with it in sight. At 2:17 a.m., according to the kitchen clock, the lantern gave a single, soft chime, like a spoon on a jar, and then was quiet again. He keeps it by his door now. He tells me it works better than any electric light when the power goes out. He doesn't rent winter cabins anymore, but he walks at dusk when the air smells like iron and wood smoke, and the snow thins to blue. Sometimes he sees a light between the trees, white-centered and patient. He does not follow. He tips his head, the way you do when a neighbor passes, and keeps walking. He ends his email to me with this: "There are things you borrow and things you keep. I think the woods know the difference better than we do." CD never returned to that specific cabin. He jokes about it with his friends, calls it the one that tidies itself, but he checks the time whenever a lantern chimes on a TV show, like part of him expects a response. He keeps a box by his door labeled "For Returning." And sometimes he puts things in it. A glove he found, a key he washed out of a driveway puddle with his boot, a photograph someone left at the laundromat. The box stays full. He hasn't yet decided where to bring it. Before you go, have you ever seen a light where it shouldn't be? A lantern, a candle, a glow that felt like it belonged to someone else? The second story comes from a couple who rented a winter cabin for peace and quiet, only to discover the silence wasn't theirs, because beneath the floorboards, something else was whispering their names. If you love atmospheric, human-told horror, subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every week, each one darker than the last. This account comes from Hannah and Mark, a couple in their early 30s from Massachusetts, who decided to spend New Year's week in the kind of cabin that looks like a postcard until you're the only ones living in it. They booked it through a family friend tucked deep in the western Maine woods, about 5 miles from the nearest plowed road.
It was one of those cabins you snowmobile into, dragging your gear on a sled behind you, with the promise of total solitude. No cell reception, no neighbors. Just stacked wood, a stove, and a roof that groaned when the drifts piled high. They arrived at dusk, breath steaming, cheeks raw from the ride-in. The cabin was simple. 2 bunks, a kitchen corner with a propane stove, and a plank floor that bowed slightly underfoot. The walls smelled like pine sap and old smoke. At first, it was everything they wanted. They cooked pasta, drank boxed wine, and laughed at the way the wind seemed to wrap the whole cabin like a sleeping bag. Outside, the forest pressed close, dark and endless. Inside, the lanterns painted everything gold. The first odd thing came on their second night. Hannah woke just past midnight, heart racing for no reason she could name. Mark was snoring softly beside her, one hand curled against his chest. The stove had burned down to coals. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Then she heard it. A whisper, faint, almost lost under the creak of wood, coming from beneath the floorboards. She held her breath. Hannah? Her name stretched thin, as if spoken through cupped hands. She sat upright, every muscle prickling. "Mark," she whispered, shaping his arm. He groaned, half asleep. "What is it?" "Listen." They both sat still. The cabin's silence pressed in. Then, as if waiting for acknowledgement, the voice came again. "Mark." Clearer this time, direct. Mark's eyes snapped open. He whispered, "Where's that coming from?" They leaned over the side of the bunk, staring at the floor. Just wide pine planks, cracked and warped by decades of winters. The whispers had no source, no mouth, no breath, but they rose through the boards as though the earth itself spoke. The couple scrambled out of bed, lantern in hand. They crouched, pressing ears to the floor. And that's when they realized. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. Murmurs overlapped in a low chorus, dozens of whispers, tangled and urgent. Some were too faint to catch, others were clear as day. "Don't leave. Stay here. We're cold. Down here." Hannah clapped her hands over her ears, but the voices pressed through anyway, vibrating her skull like the hum of power lines. Mark staggered back, muttering, "This is impossible. The ground's frozen. Nothing could be down there." They grabbed coats and boots and rushed outside. The cold slapped them, harsh and metallic. Their lantern light caught only trees, snow, and the sagging outline of the cabin. They circled the structure, stomping through drifts. No crawl space, no basement, just solid ground, sealed and frozen, buried under 2 feet of snow. But from inside, the whispers continued. They sounded louder when heard from out here, as though the cabin itself was amplifying them.
Mark shouted, "Hello?" But the voices didn't answer him. They just kept layering, climbing, until Hannah swore she could pick out the cry of a child. They fled back inside, slammed the door, and shoved a chair against it, even though no one was out there. For the rest of the night, they sat on the bunks, too afraid to lie down. The voices eventually dulled, fading around dawn, like a crowd dispersing. The next day, Hannah wanted to leave. Mark convinced her they'd come all this way, and maybe it was pipes, or frost cracking the wood, or their minds playing tricks. But that evening, as the sun dropped and the woods closed in, the unease returned. This time, they decided to test it. When the whispers started again, soft, rising like a draft, they both leaned down and asked, "Who are you?" The voices swelled. Some hissed. Some laughed. One, clear as glass, whispered, "We are the floor." Mark's skin went cold. He yanked Hannah back. "Don't answer them," he muttered, as if by instinct. But it was too late, because now the whispers said their names again, over and over, layered like a chant. Hannah, Mark, Hannah, Mark. The floorboards creaked under invisible weight, though neither of them moved. Dust sifted from the seams, shaken loose by vibrations that had no source. The stove clinked as if something tapped it. Their lantern dimmed, then flared. They couldn't take it. They rushed outside again, pulling the door shut, standing in the snow with their breath steaming in the dark. From out here, the cabin glowed faintly, as if lit from below. The snow at its base seemed disturbed, not smooth, as if something beneath had pressed upward, straining against the weight of earth. They didn't go back in. They huddled by the tree line until dawn, numb and shaking. When daylight came, the cabin looked ordinary again. Just wood, snow, silence. They packed fast, lashed their gear to the sled, and rode out without looking back. Weeks later, back home, Hannah had a dream. She was back in the cabin, staring at the floor. The planks shifted, rising like a lid, and from beneath came pale hands, dozens of them, pushing upward. When she woke, she checked her phone. A new voicemail sat in her inbox. No number, just static, and layered through it, faint but distinct, 2 words repeated over and over. "Stay here, stay here, stay here." Hannah and Mark won't rent cabins anymore. Not in Maine, not anywhere. Even hotels make Hannah uneasy if the floors creak too much. They tell people they just got spooked. But between themselves, they admit they never felt alone in that cabin. They both swear the voices didn't just want to be heard. They wanted company. And if they had stayed another night, they're not sure the floor would have held. Before you go, what do you think those voices were? Spirits? Memories? Or something alive beneath the frozen ground? If quiet, chilling horror like this keeps you hooked, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell.
The third story involves a young couple snowed in, a single frost-covered window, and a mystery that grew worse each night. Because no matter how tightly they sealed it, the window always opened again. If you love true-style horror stories told like someone lived them, subscribe and ring the bell. New stories every week, each one darker than the last. This account comes from Marissa, who spent a winter week with her boyfriend Eric in a lakeside cabin near Rangeley, Maine. It was meant to be romantic. Snowshoeing, cocoa by the fire, board games, the kind of cabin escape people post pictures of with captions about unplugging. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, a mile off the nearest road, with nothing but spruce and birch crowding its back. It was small, 1 room and a loft, warmed by a wood stove and lit with gas lamps. The lake's ice cracked at night like distant gunshots. It was charming, until the second night. The problem was a window, a single square window by the bunk, frosted around its edges. The latch was old brass, stiff but functional. Eric locked it tight before they went to bed. They even joked about it because the wind rattled the pane like a child trying to get in. But when they woke, the window stood wide open. Snow dusted the sill. Their breath fogged white in the cold. The blankets were stiff with frost where the air had poured in. Marissa sat up, teeth chattering. "Eric, did you—" "No," he said immediately. He jumped from the bunk and slammed it shut, fumbling with the latch until it caught again. His face was pale, his hands trembling not just from the cold. They chalked it up to old wood. Maybe the frame had warped, Maybe the latch had slipped loose. All day they kept it locked. Eric checked it compulsively, rattling the pane until it squeaked in protest. It stayed shut. But that night, again. They woke to the same icy air, the same frost spreading like veins across their blankets, the same window wide open to the lake. This time, footprints marked the snow outside. Bare footprints, leading up to the sill, but none leading away. Eric's nerves frayed fast. He wanted to leave. Marissa insisted they stay. She thought maybe it was wildlife, a trick of wind and thaw, something explainable. But the third night changed her mind. They locked the window, shoved a chair under the frame, stacked books on the sill, even wedged the lantern against the latch. They built a barricade of nonsense, the way children do when they know something wants in. They lay awake for hours, listening to the wood stove tick as it cooled, the lake groan, the trees sigh. Just as their eyes began to droop, a sound snapped them alert. Click. The latch moving. They both sat up, hearts hammering. The book slid from the sill, the chair groaned forward, the lantern tipped, clanging against the floorboards. The window opened, slow and deliberate. The air that rushed in was colder than anything they'd felt outside. Not just winter cold, empty cold. The kind of cold that makes your lungs seize. And with it came a sound. Whispering. Not words, just breath shaped almost into syllables. A cadence that pressed against their eardrums until Marissa clapped her hands over hers. Eric bolted from the bunk. He slammed the window shut, muscles straining against something unseen pushing back. He locked the latch, shoved the chair under again, chest heaving. Silence. But when he turned, Marissa saw it first. Frost. Not on the glass. On the inside wall, spreading outward from the window like roots. Thin white fingers reaching across the boards. She screamed. Eric grabbed the lantern, relit it, and held it high. The frost receded. Not melted, but pulled back, retreating toward the window until it was gone. The window rattled, locked tight. They didn't sleep. The fourth night, they dragged their mattress into the kitchen corner, as far from the window as possible. They left the lantern burning all night. Still, just before dawn, the latch flicked. The window opened. This time, they didn't see footprints outside. They saw hands, pressing up from the snow at the base of the cabin, pale and skeletal, clawing at the wood as if trying to climb inside. Dozens of them, writhing silently before sinking back under the drifts. Eric slammed the shutters closed and bolted them with rope. He swore. He said if the window opened one more time, they were gone, no matter the storm, no matter the distance. On the final night, they made a mistake. They tried to cover the window completely, nailing a blanket over it. They thought blocking it out might stop whatever pressed through. But sometime after midnight, Marissa woke to the sound of nails creaking. The blanket sagged, then dropped to the floor. The glass gleamed bare again, and the window stood open. Something leaned inside. Not a face, not a body, just a darkness thicker than dark, shaped like shoulders and a head, dripping cold across the floorboards. The whispering filled the cabin, louder than the stove's roar, rising into a frenzy of breath and syllables that bent her name until she thought it would split her in half. Eric grabbed the hatchet. He charged, swinging, screaming for it to stop. The blade cut through nothing but air. The darkness shrank back, slipping out into the snow. The window slammed shut behind it. And this time, it stayed shut. When morning came, they packed and left without breakfast. They didn't speak until they were back at the car. Marissa looked back once. The window was open again. Marissa told me she still dreams of it. That frost spreading across walls, that whispering that wasn't words but was worse than words. Eric refuses to talk about it at all. They broke up a year later, though she says that week in Maine was when things really ended. She swears that if she walks past a window at night, even in her city apartment, sometimes she hears the faint click of a latch. And every time, she checks. Because she knows it will never stay shut. Before you go, what do you think was opening that window? A spirit? Something frozen in the lake? Or something older that Maine winters keep buried? If stories like this send chills through you, subscribe and ring the bell. New stories every week, each one darker than the last.
The fourth story comes from a fisherman who stayed alone on Moosehead Lake and discovered that every night at exactly 2 a.m., someone came to knock on his cabin door. If strange, slow-burn stories like this get under your skin, subscribe and ring the bell. I post new horror every week. This account comes from Daniel, a retired school teacher who spent his life chasing quiet. He's not the type to spook easily. He's lived through nor'easters, handled power outages with candles and grit, and walked home alone from town meetings on moonless nights without a flashlight. But he swears what happened to him one winter at Moosehead Lake still makes him leave the porch light on at night, even in his suburban home. Daniel rented the cabin in February. A friend from church owned it. A weathered wooden structure perched on the edge of the frozen lake, framed by black pines. It was the kind of place men went to ice fish, drink rye whiskey, and forget about their cholesterol. He went alone. The cabin was simple: bunk, stove, table. One narrow window overlooking the lake. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the shoreline. The nearest town was 20. The silence was so thick, he could hear his own pulse in it. The first night passed in peace. He cooked beans, played solitaire by lantern light, and tucked himself into the bunk. The stove hissed, the lake groaned under its ice, and the woods sighed like lungs exhaling. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., someone came to knock on his cabin door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not the crackle of a tree branch, not the boom of settling wood. A knock. He sat up, heart thudding, the blankets crackling with frost. "Who's there?" he called. His voice sounded small in the cabin. No answer. He waited. Minutes passed. The stove ticked. Nothing moved. Finally, he chalked it up to the wind playing tricks and lay back down. The second night, it happened again. At 2 a.m. sharp, 3 knocks. Firm, patient. This time he got up. He lit the lantern, shuffled to the door, and pressed his ear to the wood. No footsteps outside. No crunch of snow. Just silence. He unlatched the door, opened it an inch. The cold slammed him. The porch was empty. The snow was untouched. He closed it, locked it, and told himself not to think about it. The third night, the knocks came louder. They rattled the thin glass in the window. He sat up, every nerve taut. He didn't move this time. He just listened. And then, for the first time, a voice followed. Daniel. His name spoken low, deep, with the weight of someone who'd known him a long time. He froze. His breath puffed clouds in the cold air. He whispered back, "Who is it?" Silence. He didn't sleep after that. The fourth night, he prepared. He stacked wood by the door. He left the lantern burning. He gripped the old hunting rifle his father left him. At 1:59, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. At 2 a.m., the knocking came. 3 times. Slow. Heavy. The voice followed, clearer this time. "Daniel, let me in," he shouted back. "No!" The silence that followed was worse than the voice. It stretched until his ears rang, and then, finally, something else. The sound of someone walking away. Bootsteps in the snow. Except the snow was deep. Any step should have crunched. But this was softer. Like the sound of dragging. Something heavy, moving across the porch. He didn't open the door. On the 5th night, it escalated. At 2 a.m., the knocks came hard enough to rattle dust from the rafters. The voice boomed. "Daniel, open the door." He gripped the rifle so tight his knuckles ached. He shouted, "Leave me alone!" Silence. And then, suddenly, the window. Something leaned against it. Not a face, a shape. A dark human outline pressed against the frost, so close the glass bowed inward. He saw no features, just the suggestion of shoulders and head, darker than the night outside. The lantern flickered, the stove dimmed. His breath came fast, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow vanished. The window frosted over again. The final night, Daniel didn't try to fight it. He sat at the table, lantern burning, rifle across his lap, waiting. At 2 a.m., the knocking came. 3 times. Slow. Heavy. The voice didn't just say his name. It whispered something else. "We're still here." Not I. We. Daniel stood, trembling. He shouted, "What do you want?" The reply came soft, like lips pressed to the crack in the door. "Company." The knob turned. The latch rattled. He threw his weight against the door. He held it shut with everything in him, every muscle straining as the wood bowed inward under invisible pressure. The lantern swung, casting frantic shadows, and then it stopped. The pressure eased. The latch stilled. The silence returned. When dawn came, he opened the door. The porch was covered in snow. No footprints. No sign of anyone ever standing there. But carved into the wood of the door, deep, fresh, unmistakable, were 3 words. "See you again." Daniel left Moosehead Lake that morning. He never returned. He keeps the door latch from that cabin. The owner replaced it after his stay. It sits on his desk now. A paperweight. He says sometimes around 2 a.m. he wakes for no reason. He lies still, listening. And though he's miles from Maine, surrounded by suburban quiet, he swears he hears it still. 3 knocks. Every time. Tell me in the comments, what do you think came to knocking? A ghost? Something older that walks Moosehead Lake? If true-style horror like this gets under your skin, subscribe and ring the bell. New stories every week. Until then, don't open the door when the knocking comes, no matter how polite it sounds. Sweet dreams.